Australia, the great sunlit continent of the southern seas. Over 30 times the size of Great Britain, yet with a total population less than that of London. 7 million Australians, 97% of British stock. A young country with a great future, a progressive country, busy with the development of her great natural resources, busy making her valuable contribution towards the welfare of all the peoples of the world. But Australia had a neighbor with other ideas about progress. Japan was engaged on a different kind of career, a career that she felt would be more successful if she took a couple of partners. Between them, they worked out a plan. Its object was very simple, just the conquest of the whole world. First, Germany, aided by her timorous but treacherous ally, fascist Italy, would conquer most of Europe, including a substantial chunk of Russia. Next, the drive to the east, through the Balkans, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Arabia, and so on to India from the west. Next, to complete the conquest of the whole of Africa. Meanwhile, Japan would finish off the conquest of China, then carry on through Indochina, Siam, and Burma, to link up with the Germans in India. From Siam, the Japanese New Order would spread down the Malay Peninsula, across to the Philippines, the East Indies, and on to Australia and New Zealand. After that, what was left of Russia? Then these gangsters planned to spill over into the American continent. That was to be the New World Order. Two minds with but a single thought. By 1939, Japan had conquered Manchuria and was eating steadily into China. And in September, Hitler took the next step by striking at Poland. The German-Japanese plan was well underway. The democracies knew there was only one way of stopping it. On the 3rd of September 1939, Great Britain declared war on Germany. 1 hour later, Mr. Menzies, Australian Prime Minister, said to his country,
"Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of the persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war."
And so Australia, the first dominion to take her stand at the side of the mother country, went to war.
Our Sovereign Lord the King.
Our Sovereign Lord the King.
In the military forces.
In the military forces.
Of the Commonwealth of Australia.
Of the Commonwealth of Australia.
Until the cessation.
Until the cessation.
The other side of the world, things were much the same. The same delicious cuisine, the same luxurious bedrooms, the same songs. And when it came to the point, very much the same thoughts.
Look, I'm jealous, I am. I like to lock all the doors and close all the windows so nobody could even look at you.
But they went just the same. Even though the threat to their own homes was increasing every day, they still volunteered to go. For they saw that Japan and Germany were not two enemies, but one. And the immediate danger was not in the east, but in the west. So the troop ships of the Australian Imperial Force steamed away, bound for Europe and North Africa. But before the Australians could join their allies in the battle line, Hitler struck in Europe. From the darkness of Dunkirk, there flamed up a new resolve. we would come back with new guns, new tanks, and new equipment. In Great Britain, the wheels of industry began turning faster and faster. And Australia gave the same answer. She had never before produced a tank or a plane, but now she began turning out the munitions of war in ever-increasing quantities. Weapons that had been held ready to fight the Japanese were sent without hesitation to Britain. In Australia, it was guns and butter, for besides becoming an arsenal, she also became one of the main Allied larders. Australia imposed voluntary rationing on herself in order to share her food with the other Allied nations. In addition, she fed the Allied armies in the Southwest Pacific area. While her fighting men had landed in the Middle East, but a dangerous situation was developing in North Africa. The Italians had broken through from Libya into Egypt and had got as far as Sidi Barrani. Then General Wavell took up the challenge. His troops retook Sidi Barrani and then were joined by the 6th Australian Division for the attack on Bardia. This was the first battle in which the Australians took part. After 2 days fighting, Bardia fell and the drive became a stampede. The way was opened up to Tobruk and Derna. Wavell's forces chased Mussolini's legions 360 miles in little over a month. And on the 7th of February 1941, the Australians accepted the surrender of Benghazi. But the tide of battle turned. Axis reinforcements poured into Tripolitania, and Rommel's panzers rolled eastward. Back from Benghazi through Derna, they bypassed Tobruk and pushed on to Bardia, Saloum, Sidi Barrani, right to Mirza Matruh. Only Tobruk held out. A year before, few people had ever heard of this little Libyan port. But now the 9th Australian Division was to send its name ringing through the world.
Our infantry was supported by British tanks and artillery, and for quite a few weeks, Rommel gave us all he had. In one period of 52 days, the Luftwaffe made over 1,400 sorties against us. We dug ourselves out and then dug ourselves in again. And before long, got quite used to it. An underground sort of existence, but it might have been worse. The trouble was we hadn't a single plane to put in the air against him. Tobruk was beyond the range of British fighter bases. But on the ground, he didn't have it quite so much his own way. He constantly sent his tanks, many of them 22-tonners, against us, but they couldn't get past the concentrated fire of the British artillery. And we didn't just sit and wait for it. We constantly sent out fighting patrols to let them know we were still alive and kicking. On the whole, one day was very much like another. Our only link with the outside world was by sea, and the Navy did a great job running the gauntlet from Egypt to bring us supplies, mails and men, and take off the wounded. The waterfront was pretty smashed up. The harbour was a shambles, and a good deal of merchant shipping was sunk. But Rommel had his losses too.
And so, month after month, the rats of Tobruk held out, the only bright spot in a very grim picture. We had to draw on our scanty forces in Egypt to meet a growing threat in the Balkans. Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria had thrown in their lot with the winning side, but Yugoslavia and Greece resisted, and Hitler struck again. An Allied force went in to help the Greeks. With it went the 6th Australian Division. They were desert-trained troops, but were now called on to fight in the mountains, sometimes above the snow line. With so small an expeditionary force, the only possible tactics against a much superior enemy were a series of rearguard actions to harass and delay them. These tactics were successful until the surrender of the Greek army of Epirus left our flank wide open. There was nothing for it then but to fall back under continuous strafing from the air. When our forces eventually withdrew from Greece, some of the 6th Australian Division went to Egypt, the rest to Crete. They didn't have long to wait for the expected German airborne invasion. Wave after wave of German parachute and glider troops were destroyed, but they kept on coming in a never-ending stream until our defenses were saturated. Water, ammunition and food were all desperately short. The remnants of our forces fell back from Kanair and Malame to Sfakia, a village on the south coast of the island. To cover the evacuation, an Australian battalion made one last stand. The Navy took off all it could. The Australian battalion was among those left behind. Some were taken prisoner, many were killed. Yet although Crete had been lost, Hitler's program was upset. He had planned to use Crete as a springboard for the capture of Cyprus, which would open the way to Syria and Palestine. With this grip on the Suez Canal, the door to India would have been opened. But the cream of the German airborne troops had been destroyed in Crete, and the jaws never met. So Hitler had to fall back on his old friends, the tourists, who packed their bags with a change of underclothing and a clean Tommy gun and began to filter into Syria. We saw the danger in time, and Allied forces advanced into Syria. With them went the 7th and part of the 6th Australian Divisions, and the tourists repacked their bags. For all that, Hitler's dream of world domination was becoming something more than a dream. In June, he had invaded Russia. By December, he was nearing Moscow, and the Axis decided that it was time for Japan to take a hand. So, on the 7th of December 1941, while giving assurances of eternal friendship with the United States, she committed honorable treachery and attacked Pearl Harbor. After that major disaster, there seemed no way of stopping the Japanese. From Siam, they streamed across into Malaya with their eyes fixed on a glittering prize. With the capitulation of the Singapore command, the Japanese drove swiftly through the Dutch East Indies and on to New Guinea, the very gateway to Australia. New Guinea, the second largest island in the world. 330,000 square miles of jungle-covered mountains, swamps, and fast, treacherous rivers. A hot and humid land of heavy rains and fever. No fighting anywhere else in the world can be compared with the struggle in New Guinea. Here the Australians had to fight not only the Japanese, but also the jungle, the heat, the mud, the deadly tropical diseases. For the wounded, it was pure hell. From the first dressing, it was often 4 or 5 days' march to the nearest field hospital. And what a march.
It was a pretty grim sort of existence, but the troops managed to keep going. It's wonderful what a hot meal will do, especially when you've had to wait for it. And when you can call round afterwards for coffee in the club, it becomes a real high spot. There were other high spots too.
This was New Guinea. For months, less than 4 brigades of Australian troops stood up against an overwhelming superiority of Japanese men and material. The Japanese threatened to overrun New Guinea, as they had Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. They took Salamaua, Lae, Gona, and Boona, then poised for their main objective, Port Moresby. As a preliminary, their bombers went over the Australian continent. Port Darwin and many other places in the north and east coasts were attacked from the air. Port Darwin itself was raided 64 times, all part of a softening up process for a direct invasion of Australia as soon as Port Moresby fell into their hands. They planned a 3-pronged attack: a landing at Milne Bay and thence along the coast, a drive across the Owen Stanley Ranges, and a direct invasion from the sea. The Milne Bay landing was thrown back. The direct invasion was smashed in the Battle of the Coral Sea, but the 3rd prong, the attack across the Owen Stanleys, the range of mountains that stood between Japanese-held Boona and Gona and Port Moresby, that was a different matter. The 1st Australian unit to meet the advancing Jap was an untried battalion. They met an enemy more than 3 times their strength, yet managed to hold them up for more than a month. On August the 16th, 1942, an Australian reinforcement brigade marched out from Port Moresby into the hills. They had to do what no white man had ever done before in New Guinea: carry loads of anything up to 90 pounds a man as they struggled up the trail. It was a 6 days' march from Port Moresby to the battle area, yet of the whole brigade, only 8 men dropped out. Company after company of this new brigade went into action, but the Japanese were pouring in reinforcements, and the Australians were forced to fall back, fighting a stubborn, delaying action every foot of the way. At last, out of the brigade, only 3 companies remained. In front of them were 5 Japanese battalions. And here on Ioribaiwa Ridge, the Australians dug in their heels. There could be no more withdrawing, for at their backs was Port Moresby. Somehow or another, that thin line of Australians held on, and Ioribaiwa Ridge became the turning point in the Pacific War, the limit of the Japanese advance. Now came the turning point for Germany, too, for in the west, Rommel was held at El Alamein. On the night of the 23rd of October, 1942, the Allies hit back at the Afrika Korps. In spite of the dangerous situation in New Guinea, other Australian units helped in the great North African breakthrough. Of the part they played in the battle, the British report said, "The 9th Australian Division put up a magnificent effort. They fought themselves and the enemy to a standstill, till flesh and blood could stand no more. Then they went on fighting." After the breakthrough, the Australians were moved to the other end of the world battlefront. From Eora Byward Ridge, the Australian Army had but one rule: attack. The Japs were flung back over the Owen Stanleys. They were driven from Kokoda, Boona, Gona, Sanananda, Salamaua. The next objective was Lae.
The Allied plan was to capture Lae by a combined operation. 2 Australian divisions were concerned, the 9th and the 7th. The 9th would go by sea from Milne Bay, land on the shore of the Huon Gulf, and drive along the coast to Lae. The 7th would go by air from Port Moresby to Nadzab, land on the airstrip, then close in on Lae. The operations began. In the steamy morning heat, the 9th, desert fighters from Tobruk and Alamein, were embarked for the first land and fight assault in which Australians had been engaged since Gallipoli. The American Navy and Air Force cooperated. While all this had been going on, the 7th Div was completing its preparations. Australian paratroop artillery and American paratroops led the way to Nadzab. This was the first time that artillery was landed by parachute, and most of the Australians had never before made a parachute descent. While they were gaining control of the airstrip, the 7th was emplaning at Port Moresby. When they arrived at Nadzab, the airstrip was ready for them. Kunai grass had got a strong hold on the strip, but American flamethrowers soon burnt it down. The whole operation went through without a hitch, and shortly after their arrival at Nadzab, the 7th moved down the rough road and captured Lae. In the meantime, the 9th had been landed on Red Beach and had fought their way along the coast. They got to Lae a couple of hours too late. By the time they arrived, the 7th had already captured the place. So they re-embarked from Lae to move northward round the Huon Peninsula to attack and finally capture Finschhafen, Saddleberg and Sio. The 7th Division moved on from Lae up the Markham Valley, captured Kayapit and advanced into another fever-ridden locality known to the natives as Ramu, the Valley of Green Death. This was flanked on the right by the Finisterre Ranges, on which the Japanese had strongly defended positions. From these, they were able to command the entire line of our advance in this area. To enable the advance to continue, the Japanese had to be driven from their positions, and a series of actions was fought, culminating in the now famous Battle of Shaggy Ridge. The assault was given the name of Operation Cutthroat, and with reason. Australian artillery opened the attack. Next, Japanese foxholes were pounded from the air by Australian boomerangs and American kitty hawks. And finally, the infantry went in. Advancing on practically a one-man front, they clambered and fought their way up 500 yards of razor-backed mountain.
The ridge was won. The way was open to Bogger Jim, Madang and Alexishaven, and the Allied advance went on. Throughout the world, the forces of liberation are on the move. The grip of the Axis is loosened.
With the campaign in New Guinea well in hand, though not concluded, new areas were allotted by the Supreme Allied Command to the Australian Army as the orbit of their future actions. The outer islands lying off New Guinea, New Britain and the Solomons were first included in the new perimeter of battle. The spirit of victory was with the Australian forces that sailed for the Solomons in November 1944. Experienced in jungle fighting, well armed and eager to come to grips with the Jap, troops of the 2nd Australian Corps took over in Bougainville from the United States Army. For the Americans, Bougainville had been a stepping stone in their northward drive. For the Australians, the whole island became an objective, the scene of bitter fighting. The drive into the interior was soon on. Nothing was forgotten, not even the mascot. One of the major battles was fought for Artillery Hill. The field guns, the 25-pounders, had the first say. Fire! Guns and howitzers pounded the distant hills, supported by mortar fire. Every man was in position at the ready, waiting for the attack. Bitter fighting followed, but the advance proceeded according to plan. Japanese positions presented a grim sight. Our fire had been deadly accurate. But the Australian troops who had borne the brunt of the battle suffered casualties too. Seriously wounded had to be sent far behind the firing line to base hospital, carried by faithful natives on stretchers sometimes for days over patrol routes and jungle paths. At the base hospitals, doctors and nurses would immediately attend to the wounded, and many lives were saved through their skill and medical care. But some had to leave their coppers behind. Nothing, not even the mascot, could save them. The advance continued. Artillery Hill was captured, another landmark on the road to victory. When the war ended, enemy opposition had been overcome along the whole west coast of Bougainville. The Australian troops were in complete strategic control of the... At the same time, operations were in progress 200 miles away at New Britain, where the northeast of the island, the Gazelle Peninsula, was strongly held by the Japs. The 5th Australian Division had fought their way along the north coast, and in the south, operating from Jackanow Bay, they had approached the narrow neck near Waitavalo, ready for the drive to Rabaul, principal base of the Japanese in the southwest Pacific. Slowly, cautiously, our patrols advanced towards an enemy pinned down by artillery fire, exploring the hundreds of tracks disappearing in all directions. It was a battle for the foxholes, for lurking snipers hidden in trees, a dangerous task, mainly a reconnaissance. We captured some of their latest weapons, got hold of secret information about their hideouts. From foxhole to foxhole, we cleared them out, from miles and miles of Jap-infested jungle until the Japs surrendered, and we surrendered the jungle to its eternal peace. With the Australian forces firmly established in the Solomons and New Britain, the campaign for the final defeat of the Jap in New Guinea was soon in progress in the Aitape-Wewak area. The 6th Australian Division that landed at Aitape took over the defense of the harbour and airstrip from the United States forces, now concentrating at Hollandia on the drive to the north, in which Australian forces were soon to take part. Landing proceeded undisturbed by the enemy, but there were dangerous moments when fully loaded LCIs were tossed about in the heavy surf. Aitape was a vital base for the succeeding operations, which ended in the capture of Wewak and the liquidation of all Jap resistance in the New Guinea area. The campaign was at once underway. Commando patrols set out, penetrating deep into the interior to secure the hinterland, foil any design of the Jap to attack our lines from the rear, whilst guns and weapons were landed at the beach to be shifted on in our forward drive. In the Wewak area, the Japs had built up a considerable defense network. To cut off the enemy completely in this sector, a commando squadron was landed near Wewak. Here, the final blow in the New Guinea campaign was struck. Once ashore, commandos set to work with all their skill and experience, raiding and destroying the enemy's outposts, capturing his strongholds, destroying his lines of communication. Commando in the jungle, creeping along in silence. A man by himself, feeling his way, fighting the jungle, fighting an invisible foe. Anywhere may be a Jap. Listen, the voice of the enemy. There's only one reply, this one. Defending their positions with fanatical zeal, the Japs had to be killed to a man in their dugouts. "10,000 Japs were reported killed in the island campaign. War in the jungle. It was an eerie war. We hardly saw a Jap, but when we saw them, they could not see us anymore. Under cover of tanks, the last stretch of the coastline was soon cleared. Allied control of the whole British New Guinea area had been restored. Whilst the New Guinea campaign was still in progress, Allied strategy turned to the reconquest of the far-flung islands lying between New Guinea and Japan. The United States forces had set foot on the Philippines. The Australian headquarters had been established at Morotai. The reconquest of Borneo was the next task allotted to the Australian forces, with Tarakan Island their first objective in a carefully planned amphibious operation. At the end of April 1945, a modern armada carried the battle-seasoned troops of the 9th Division to Tarakan. Ships and guns go into position. It's action stations now. The bombardment has started. Men prepare for the landing. Naval guns mercilessly pound the shore, while heavy bombers plaster the enemy positions. Up in flames go the oil tanks, fires everywhere, and the smoke of the burning oil draws a black curtain across the island. An awe-inspiring sight, grimly reflected in the tense expressions on the faces of the Australian assault troops now heading for the beach. First troops ashore. The heavy and concentrated bombardment has shattered completely the enemy's fortifications. Every oil tank was on fire, every pipeline breached, depriving the Jap of his intention to use burning oil in defense of the beach. In the inferno of fire and smoke, the Japs had withdrawn. Isolated opposition was quickly checked. The landing of a complete invasion force proceeded with clockwork precision, as stores and equipment were unloaded and more men moved on from the beach. Now a scene of desolation and destruction. Throwing a wide net over the whole area, the troops fanned out in all directions, past burning oil tanks, battered into grotesque shapes by shells and bombs. Always on guard, always in touch with the base. A quick rest is snatched whenever there's a chance, and there's always a danger of a Jap ambush. Every hut on the way is searched. The Jap may spring a surprise. Ah, this time it's Japanese beer. It may be poisoned. But information by natives is valuable. The Japs may be near. Every precaution is taken. There's jungle country ahead, reminiscent of the jungle in New Guinea. Fighting continued further inland for more than 2 months after the landing. Along steep ridges and on the hills, many actions were fought before all Japanese resistance was broken. At last, the job was done. Tarakan, the gateway to Borneo, was in our hands. Coinciding with the Tarakan campaign, the Australian forces went into action at Brunei on the northeast coast of Borneo. 2 striking forces attacked simultaneously Labuan Island at the entrance of Brunei Bay and the shores leading to Brunei town. A huge convoy had brought men of the 9th Division to Brunei Bay. The Following the usual pattern, heavy bombardment had softened up enemy positions and broken down any resistance before the assault troops hit the shore of Labuan Island. Throbbing with the spirit of attack, a flotilla of landing barges made straight for Brunei Beach, covered by the big guns of cruisers blazing away fiercely. Each landing craft filled with the finest men of the Australian fighting forces, waiting calmly and in good humor for the battle ahead. Advance was on their mind. Thrusting into the heart of the enemy's stolen empire, they now wrested from the Jap a British possession, a region with immense oil and rubber resources, a prize well worth their efforts. In their advance, no chance was taken by the men. Nothing escaped their eagle eyes. At no stage was the utmost vigilance relaxed. Mopping up continued until the last Jap party resisting behind the shambles of the residential area of Brunei was liquidated. The last Jap pocket in the town cleaned up. And some paid dearly for a creed of ruthless power and unscrupulous expansion. This was the real meaning of the Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The events of war now shifted swiftly to the southwest of Borneo, where a landing was about to take place at Balikpapan, one of the world's richest oil centers, which had been scorched and destroyed by the Dutch in a gallant sacrifice in 1942, before the Japanese invasion. Here, where one of the first chapters of the war in the Pacific was written, one of its last chapters was written too. One of the greatest convoys ever assembled during the war, comprising more than 200 vessels, carried the veterans of Kokoda, of Milne Bay and Leh, the 7th Division, into action. It was Tarakan all over. Assault barges hitting the water, alligators and landing barges cascading onto the beach. Joined in battle by the Australian and American naval and air forces, the Australian shock troops land and smash through the beach defenses. The Jap was deprived of a vital base, of oil, so vital for the wheels of Nippon's insatiable war machine. No sacrifice was too high. Soon the whole area would be taken. The Jap has to disgorge his loot. But in all these years, during the long and bitter fighting in the islands, never forgotten were the men who so gallantly fought against overwhelming odds in Malaya and were taken prisoners when Singapore fell. Here in Changi Camp, behind high prison walls, patiently waited the men for the day of liberation. In those dark days when Australia stood alone, and in the years that followed, never did they lose faith. Never once did they give up hope in final victory. Until one day, the atomic bomb brought the war in the Pacific to a sudden end, rocked to its foundation Japan's already tottering war machine. VE Day had ended the war in Europe. Germany and Italy had been beaten. Now, Japan surrendered. The empire of the rising sun crumbled to pieces. Victory in the Pacific, VP Day. The war was over, the war was won. Japan's final surrender took place in Tokyo Bay aboard the American battleship Missouri, in the presence of the Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Army, General Sir Thomas Blamey, the Chief of Staff of the Australian Forces, and high-ranking officers of the Allied forces. Plenipotentiaries of Emperor Hirohito arrived, the heads of the Japanese government and Imperial High Command, the representatives of Asia's master race. Do these cold, impenetrable faces understand that they've been beaten on the sea, in the air, and on the land? Yes, they know. This is defeat. This is Pearl Harbor for a whole nation. The surrender terms announced by General MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific, are explicit. Unconditional surrender, occupation and control of Japan for an indefinite period. Nippon's representative signed. A formidable enemy has surrendered. With his signature, General MacArthur completes the surrender documents. General Sir Thomas Blamey signs for Australia, heading the signatures of other nations. It's a day of rejoicing for the Allies, a day of honor for Australia and its fighting forces. Surrender followed quickly in all fighting areas. In the Solomons at Bougainville, as token of surrender, the leader of the beaten army hands over his sword to Lieutenant General Savage, GOC 2nd Australian Corps. The terms of surrender are read out aloud. The lesson of defeat is brought home to the wanton aggressor. Slowly he picks up the pen. His motionless face betrays his thoughts. The ignominy of defeat. He signs. Surrender. The war was won. It was won with the help of Australia's fighting men, the Australian soldier, whose outstanding courage, quality, and training had contributed so greatly to its success. Here is a beaten enemy. Defiance still in his face. On the flight deck of HMS Glory, with the ship's company on parade, and in the presence of high-ranking Australian officers, Lieutenant General Sternberg accepted surrender in the New Britain area. At Labuan, in Borneo, the Japanese general surrenders the swords to Major General Wootton, GOC 9th Division. He had been, with the heroes of Tobruk and Alamein, in the first jungle fight desert-trained troops had fought in the Southwest Pacific, in the first amphibious landing any Australian unit had undertaken since Gallipoli. Intelligence officers of the staff immediately set to work to make the surrender effective. The Japs had to submit full details of their fighting strength, hand over maps of their strategical positions, of ammunition dumps and hospitals. The fullest information is demanded. This is unconditional surrender. Representatives of every unit of his division were on parade at Cape Wong when Major General Robertson, GOC 6th Australian Division, accepted the surrender of the Japs for the whole New Guinea area. The words spoken by General Sir Thomas Blamey at the surrender ceremony at Morotai were on the lips of every digger present. I do not regard you as a gallant and honorable foe. Outplanned and outfought, the Japs had met their masters. Fighting for power, they had yielded to power. The spirit of freedom alone is invincible. The war was over. Now the gates of the prison camp swung open as they had opened in Europe before. The long years of waiting, of mental strain and anxieties, of hunger and disease were over. Now the Australian flag flew proudly high over the prison walls. Now the tables were turned. Retribution came swift. A monstrous enemy was put in his place under guard. Arrogant and cruel when in power, submissive and servile in defeat. You beaut. Good news came from home. Repatriation was in full swing. Soon, ships would come to bring home the men. And outside the dreaded prison walls marched smartly in step the liberated men. They had played their part well. Theirs, too, was the glory of victory. From the islands thousands of miles away, from the battlefields and prison camps, from beachheads and jungles, the troops sailed home. 3 more days, 2 more, 1. There was Sydney. Every transport that arrived was greeted at the wharf by a cheering crowd. There was Mum. Daddy, here I am. From boat after boat that arrived, officers and men disembarked. For years they'd been a team, living and fighting together as one. Now each of them would go his own way, live his own life in peace. For peace, Australia went to war, and peace was all Australian soldiers ever fought for. Victory Parade. A jubilant population widely cheered the victorious troops marching proudly through the big cities of Australia. They had fought and beaten a well-equipped, well-trained enemy. They had fought in the desert and in the grueling country of the jungle where no white man had ever fought before, on deadly beaches, over mountain tracks and unscalable ridges. They had pressed home the attack until the enemy surrendered, until victory was won. Salute to the Australian military forces. Salute to the AIF and the women's services who assisted them. came the last parade, the best of all parades for many, demobilization. Sign here, sign there, sign everywhere, sign off. The rights of rehabilitation for all who had served in the Australian military forces were well established. To protect in the years of peace those who had gallantly protected Australia in the years of war was a debt of honor gladly shouldered by the whole Australian nation. Now they would take up their peaceful trades and professions, would go home to their families. Australia was at peace.
Out of every 10 Australians of military age, 7 have served in the forces. Regardless of home ties, they've gone out to serve, fight and die for the Allied cause all over the world. The spirit of Tobruk and Alamein, of Urabiwa and Shaggy Ridge, lives on.
On lives the spirit of New Britain, Bougainville, of Wewak, Tarakan, Brunei, Balikpapan. The spirit of the victorious Australian Army lives on.